Hello, welcome back to another episode of the Dr. Supercoach YouTube. You're on with Pig Mentality, and I'm back to give you my captain recommendations for round 5. So this week, we're back to best 18. So that means you probably have an easy loophole option, whether you've got Dacos, Heeney, Jordan, Roberts, whoever it is. Remember, there are kind of two ways you can approach the captaincy game. Some people like to have 2 cracks at a safe 120. Lock away a good cruisy weekend, don't stress about it. Or you can play how I play, which is I try and identify who I think is going to be my highest scoring player, and I'll use the VC on them, even if that's later in the week. So sometimes I've actually VC'd on a Sunday because I think that's going to be my highest scoring player. But the caveat with that is you need a safe 120 fullback after them, and you need a loophole that's going to work. So last week, I said I was going to VC Butters into Isaac Heeney. That was despite projecting Isaac Heeney to be my highest scoring player. And the reason I was going to be forced into that is because I didn't think I had a loophole option playing after Heeney. He played at the same time. He played against my West Coast loophole. So I thought I was being forced into Butters. But then Alex Sexton was dropped and I was given my loophole. So I moved the VC onto Heeney because, as I said, I thought he would be my highest scorer of the round. I reaped the rewards of his 165. My fullback option would have been Tim English, which wouldn't have been amazing. It would have done the job, but, wouldn't have made me that happy. But Heeney's 165, and that's kind of an example, a really good illustration of why I like to VC who I think is going to be my highest scorer. Because if I had to VC Butters, which I thought I was going to be forced into, I probably would have taken that 119 just to be safe, and I wouldn't really have even given myself a chance to look at Heeney's VC. So that's why I play like this. I don't want to be forced into taking a 119 or a 122 or a 125 or whatever it is if I think there's bigger things coming. So that's how I like to play, but you really need a safe 120 playing after them, and you need your loop to work. So I got a bit lucky, well, unlucky, but Sexton was dropped. That allowed me to do that. So looking ahead to round 5, it's a bit of a strange round. I'm projecting a lot of kind of 115 to 130 scores. Like I'm seeing a lot of premiums, at least just from the matchups that I think they'll score in that range. But I actually think there's going to be very few giant kind of 140 plus options. There might only be 1 or 2 players that go 140 this week. So getting on to whoever does pop, that kind of may set you apart. In addition, nearly all of my captaincy picks play in the first 3 games. In fact, 7 of my 9 recommendations will have locked by 2 p.m. Saturday. That's quite unusual, actually. Normally, we're kind of spread out through the weekend, but here it's the first 3 games. So you could treat it like a fixed lockout. You could VC early, loop if you need, then just put your feet up by lunchtime Saturday. And this round is also looking like an absolute goldmine for our Supercoach Ruckman, with a lot of them having favourable matchups. In previous episodes, I've talked about targeting Ruckman with the captaincy option when they're matching up with an opposition that doesn't win many hitouts, as I generally find that these rucks often get their big spike scores when they add hitouts to advantage to their other more consistent stats. So I've talked before about Tim English, for example, whatever he may average. I'm just pulling it out of the top of my head, but let's say he's going to get kind of 20 disposals and 5 marks, most games. That his opposition isn't really going to change that. But when he does have his spike score is when he's playing against, often a shorter ruckman that doesn't win many hitouts, and he can actually win the hitout battle and get a lot of them to advantage because they are Supercoach Gold. You score a lot of points from hitout to advantage. Or the Max Gorn secret sauce is just being bigger, grabbing it out of the ruck and putting it on the boot and getting the clearance yourself. So when you're playing against a ruckman that doesn't win the hit out very much, that's where I often see these big giant spike scores from our ruckman. And that's what I mean when I say that they've got an easy matchup. They're playing someone who doesn't get that many hit outs. So without giving too much away, 44% of my VC or C recommendations come from the ruck spot this week. So let's get into it. I'm going to start with 3 VCs as always, and I am going to nominate these ones as VCs, A, because they play early in the round, but it's actually more B, because I think these ones are the only ones with the real potential to do that kind of 130 to 140 or more this week. And when I talk about the C's a bit later, they're all just like safe 120, 125s, I think. So these VCs, you want to VC the high projected guys. And I think these three are probably the ones that I've got the most faith in. They may not. They may still get a 115 or something, but I've got a bit more faith in these guys having a bit of a spike. The number 3 is Marcus Bontempelli. So the Bont returned to prime captain form last week with a 141, albeit that was against Geelong, who are quite an easy midfield matchup at the moment. This week, he returns home to Marvel Stadium on a Friday night to take on the Bombers. Bont's history against Essendon isn't really amazing. Scores of 126, 115 and 123 in their last 3 matchups are fine, but they aren't really the high upside you want to chase for a VC. When you combine this with the fact that Essendon haven't given up any 130-plus scores to kind of those inside contested beasts that the other teams have yet, Essendon have actually been really good at the clearance most of the year, and they're limiting those kind of contested beast guys. So the Steels and the Heenies that played them, they scored pretty well, and the Butters as well, but they didn't go over 130. So that's kind of the reason I have Bont down a bit at number 3. But Bont kind of doesn't necessarily play like those guys. He plays a little bit different. With Essendon, the shining light for Bont here is that Essendon have restricted the opposition clearance midfielders. So let's say I'm predicting them to limit Libba, but they've really leaked points to the midfielders that push hard forward and impact the scoreboard. So Goulden scored 149 and Rosie scored 152 on the Bombers this year. And I kind of see Bont more as that similar player to them rather than similar to the Steels and the Heenies. So Bont, he can get his ball in the midfield, but I really see him bursting out of the contest and hitting the scoreboard in this game. And I can, see him running right against the Bombers, who have really struggled with their defensive accountability this season. So Bombers have limited inside mids, but the ones that are faster, get out the front of the pack, hit the scoreboard, like I said, Heenies and Gouldens. Rosies and Gouldens, they have scored well, and I put Bont in that basket. So I would be very comfortable VCing Bont and hope for a big one. Number 2 VC option, Nick Martin. Nick Martin makes his debut in my captain's video, this week in round 5. Nick started the season with scores of 63 and 93, which prompted a lot of coaches to trade him out. But he's since worked out his role and he stopped kind of taking the risky option every time. He's actually hitting his targets now. He scored 136 in round 3 against an easy defender matchup. St Kilda give up a lot of points to defenders. That wasn't a huge surprise. But the surprise came last week when he scored 133 against one of the hardest matchups for opposition defenders. And to the eye, his game was very impactful and he kind of seems back in control. So this week's matchup should make your mouth water. Martin plays against the Bulldogs, who over the last 10 games have given up the most points to opposition defenders and especially to opposition designated kickers. So this is a prime matchup for someone in Nick Martin's role. Under the roof at Marvel on Friday night, if you don't own my number 1 VC recommendation, who's coming up next, or if you want to kind of go for a high upside player away from the crowd, I think Nick Martin VC against this Bulldogs matchup could be a really good option. Sorry. Number 1 VC option, and this one does get me very excited, Max Gawn. So this actually might be the easiest VC of the year here. Max is averaging 131 this season, and he's coming off 129 against one of the most restrictive hit-out ruckmen in the league. So Riley O'Brien really restricts ruckmen getting hit-outs against him. And Gawn was actually on 80 at halftime, and then he kind of slowed down. So the fact that Gawn still got a 129 against a restrictive ruckman, I think that's really impressive. This week, Gawn matches up with Oscar McInerney and Joe Danaher. So they're kind of the Brisbane ruck duo on Thursday night. This duo, they only win the hit out in 37% of their ruck contests. So that ranks them in my scale as an easy ruck matchup. 37, that's one of the lower ones in the league. This should leave plenty of hit outs available to Max to either hit his teammates to advantage or to grab it out of the ruck and get the clearance himself. Both of those things led to big SuperCoach points. So Max scored 215 SuperCoach points in this matchup in round 18 of last year. So 215 the last time he played them. That's insane. In that game, Gawn had 10 clearances, 8 intercept possessions, and 29 disposals. If you want a bit more data about teams that have played against Brisbane this year, Tristan Cherry scored a 115 and Luke Jackson scored a 113 on Brisbane this year. So they've done pretty well. But those guys aren't on Gawn's level. I think don't overthink this one. This is just as easy as VCing max. Have your loophole ready. I talked about a lot of kind of 115 to 130 projections potentially coming up this week. Max is the one I'm most confident to rocket past 140. So he's my number one VC. Then I'll give you my captains, and I'm going to start with a point of difference captain. And this one is only for the Brave. So my point of difference captain is Luke Davies-Uniacke. So Luke has started the season in horrible fashion. He's already lost 71k after averaging 95 through his first 4 games. That's a far cry from what owners brought him in for. So you might be thinking, why am I recommending this guy? I think this is kind of a now or never game for LDU from a Supercoach point of view. He's played 3 of the hardest midfields over his first 4 games, and his team has been destroyed in all of them. They're struggling to get their hands on it, and their best midfielder has suffered as a result. This week, LDU plays against Geelong at GMHBA. So he averages 115 Supercoach points per game against Geelong, 4 games. That is easily his most profitable opponent. He also averages 129 Supercoach points at GMHBA. That's easily his highest scoring ground. So, as I said, you would have to be extremely brave to captain LDU this week, given his poor start to the year. But if there was any recipe for a huge bounce back, surely it is against his highest scoring team at his highest scoring ground. So that gives me some faith. You'd have to be very brave to do it, but it could reward you. Number 5. So we'll go into actual captains now. And this has been tricky, to be honest, trying to find captains that are kind of going to go 130. I'm just seeing a lot of kind of that slightly lower range, but still an okay score. I actually struggled to find a 5th safe fullback captain option to recommend here in the Saturday and Sunday games. I'll tell you why. So Port and Freo, they've both been very restrictive to opposition midfielders to start this season, and they play each other. So I'm not really interested in Sarong or Butters because they both play against restrictive midfields. Geelong and North have limited the opposition defenders, which kind of moves me away from Sheasel or Stewart. I still don't really trust the Adelaide midfield. I think they've got a lot of issues to work out, and anyone could be kind of thrown out of there at any time. So Laird and Dawson I'm not really interested in, especially against Carlton. That's a hard matchup. Heeney and Dacos are on the bye. That sucks. I've been loving captaining Heeney lately. Merritt against the Bulldogs. He probably is a safe 120, but his history against them isn't really amazing. I don't mind Luke Jackson against Port if Sean Darcy doesn't play. So if Luke Jackson's solo ruck against Port, I actually quite like that. But at the time I'm recording this, teams haven't been announced, so I don't know if Sean Darcy is back or not. Jack Steele against GWS could be a play. He's got a 135 and a 140 in their last 2 meetings, but GWS are much more improved and more restrictive midfield than they were back in those days. I actually think Toby Nankervis will have a field day against the Eagles. I think he will be a great option, but I don't think anyone owns him, so I'm not going to recommend him. So for my number 5 captain option, I will recommend Tom Green. So Tom had a down week by his standards last week, but he still got a 109. That isn't a killer captain score. It isn't ideal. Prior to that, he had scores of 132, 152, and 137 to start the year. So he's in great form, and he comes up against St Kilda in Canberra. So in recent weeks, 3 players have put up 130-plus scores against the Saints. Those being Dangerfield scored a 134, Merritt scored a 131, and Shai Bolton scored a 133 against Saints in the last month. Tom doesn't really have a big history against the Saints, and he doesn't really have a good track record at Manuka Oval, but I'm just going to back in his 2024 form, and the fact that he's playing AFL Fantasy and he's ranked really highly, This gives me some confidence because he said that he's aware of the statistics and he said that he knows what he needs to do to rack up the points. And he's even captained himself in his own fantasy team in recent weeks. So I feel like you can't get more invested than that. Kieran Briggs comes in at number 4. So I promised you some ruckman this week because we got a lot of good matchups. So far, I've only given you Max Gawn. But here we go. Kieran Briggs at number 4. So Kieran Briggs, he's kind of the ultimate definition of a player that scores well in easy matchups and scores poor in hard matchups, at least from like a ruck difficulty perspective. And that might kind of sound obvious, but there are some players like English and Gawn. They kind of get enough disposals not to be worried about their opponents, really. They just have the spike games against the easy ones, but they'll still put out a big score against hard ones. But Briggs is kind of someone who does rely on the matchup. He scores well from contested possessions and tackles, but when he has his spike games, it's when he can win a lot of hitouts and boost his score with hitouts to advantage. So, for example, this year, Briggs has scored a 109 against Collingwood. They rank as a medium matchup. He then went a 57 against Tristan Cherry, who is a hard matchup. He then dominated Bailey Williams with a 139, which is the easiest matchup in the game. And then he really struggled with a 78 against Jared Witts, who's one of the hardest matchups in the game. So he's really fluctuated depending on who he's played against. This week, he matches up with Rowan Marshall, who's an easy opponent to win hitouts against. Nank scored a 133. Draper scored a 72 despite ruck sharing. Darcy Cameron a 114 and Blitzarves a 91 despite ruck sharing against Marshall this year. So all of those guys have gone above their season average by quite a bit when they've played Marshall. So I expect Briggs to be able to have a good day in the hit-out department, and I think this will be him registering one of those big SuperCoach scores against Rowan this week. I know not many people own Kieran Briggs, but I think he's a really, really safe 120 this week. Number 3, we go to another ruckman, and here I'm going Tim English. So Tim has averaged 125 points to start the 2024 season. That's really good, and that's without putting up any of his huge ceiling games. This week he plays against Essendon, who are generally a medium matchup for ruckman. So they're not really easy, they're not really hard. And Essendon have been running a 2-ruck setup this year, and have been quite difficult to start this year, and they haven't given up a ton to any ruckman this season. Those scores against Essendon so far: Soldo got a 92, Marshall got a 79. That's pretty horrible. Grundy got a 99 and Reeves got a 54. But English's previous history against the Bombers does need to be taken into consideration. A career average of 128 against Essendon from 4 games, which includes scores of 143, 123 and 204 in their last 3 matchups. So here, the Marshall 79 does scare me. But otherwise, the Essendon guys haven't really faced a premium ruckman this year. I'm not counting Grundy as a premium anymore. I'm not expecting this to be one of English's monster 140 scores in this. If Essendon play both Goldie and Draper, I'm still thinking it should be a safe 120 fallback. So this is kind of probably more of a captain option. Say if you go for Gawn or Petrarca or someone in the first game and it doesn't work, I think English's 120 safe fallback's good, but he probably doesn't have the big ceiling in this one that I think maybe Bont or Nick Martin, who I mentioned earlier, do. We then go to number 2, and as promised, I'm going to give you another ruckman. And this time I'm going back to Canberra and I'm going to Rowan Marshall. So Rowan has had an inconsistent start to the season, and this is highlighted by a score of 79 and a score of 147 in his last 2 matches. So the 147 shows what he can do, and that was built on the back of 100 SuperCoach points in the second half alone of last week's game. This week, he gets the second easiest ruck matchup in the league over the last 5 games, a matchup with Kieran Briggs. So Kieran Briggs and Cadman combined to win the hit-out in only 34% of their ruck contests. That's, as I said, the second lowest. That leaves a lot of hit-outs available to their opponents. And Rowan can score in a variety of ways. He does specialise in combining big tackle and big mark numbers. That's kind of what he does. But like a lot of these ruckmen, when he has his spike scores is when he matches up with a smaller ruckman, and he can also add some hitouts to advantage numbers to his score. So to illustrate this, in 2013, in all games where Rowan Marshall went below 130 SuperCoach, he averaged 7.1 hitouts to advantage. Compare this to his 6 games where he scored over 130. His hitouts to advantage average in those games was 9.5. So he's getting about an extra 2.5 hitouts to advantage per game in his giant kind of spike 130 scores. So that's kind of where I'm talking about the hitouts to advantage are kind of just what boosts and puts these premium ruckmen into that like 130 plus territory is when they can get those numbers. His matchup this week is a prime chance to increase his hit-out numbers and put up a big score. And you might be a bit confused as to why I've recommended both Rowan Marshall and Kieran Briggs when they play each other. And I've kind of both said they have good matchups, and you're like, oh, how's that happen? But if you look at it this way, when they play against a dominant tap ruckman like Jared Witts or Sean Darcy, they might lose the hit-out battle, 15 to 45, for example. They might get destroyed. But when they play in an evenly matched tap ruckman, so in this case, both poor tap ruckman, they might kind of break even, and they might, one might win 30 hitouts, another one might win 30 hitouts instead of going 15-45. So that in theory, that gives both of them kind of an extra 15 hitouts compared to what they might normally do against a hard ruckman. So that's why it can kind of boost both of their score. So yes, they're playing each other, but because they're both easy matchups, they both could score really well, and they both could have a lot more hitouts to score really well. We then go to my number one captain option, and as I talked through the captains before, 2, 3, 4, 5, they're all guys that I'm probably putting less than 130, but probably more than 110, so they're just that safe fallback. This is the only player playing in a later game that I'm really, really confident in, and this is Matt Rowell. So Matt's taken his game to another level this year. He's averaging 130 SuperCoach points from his 4 games. He's doing this through record clearance and contested possession numbers, but encouragingly, he's also getting plenty of tackles and a few score involvements. So that will continue to help his production. This week he plays against Hawthorn, who over the last 5 games, they are the easiest matchup for opposition midfielders. So to start the season, the Hawks have given up 138 points to Jordan De Goey, 146 points to Christian Petrarca, and 127 points to Zach Merritt. I expect Jared Witts to be able to win the hit-out battle pretty easily against Lloyd Mackey in this one, which should give the Gold Coast midfielders first access to the ball. And sometimes it's just as simple as when we have a player on a hot streak, combined with a very, very easy matchup, I think we just have to take notice. So if you own Matt Rowell, I think he's a great option. So, as I said before, I don't expect there to be many scores over 140 this week. I think there's going to be a lot kind of in the slightly below that tier. Max Gawn is the one that I'm really, really confident can go over 140, so I would absolutely be VCing him. I'd be pretty okay thinking Matt Rowell could probably push that number as well. So if you have Matt Rowell, that's a great option. LDU has a slight chance just based on his matchup and his history against this team. If he turns his form around, maybe there's a chance. The other 2, Bont and Martin, are ones that I'm giving like a less of a chance, but still an okay chance. So they're solid. And then if none of them work for you, you VC'd them and you need a fallback, the Tom Green, Kieran Briggs, Tim English, Rowan Marshall, I think they're all going to be safe captain scores. I don't think they're going to be giants, but they'll be solid. So what I'm going to do, I project Max Gawn against Brisbane to be my highest scorer in my team this week. So he's going to get my VC armband. Just very convenient that he plays the first game. If he played Saturday night, I would still save the VC for him. That's kind of how keen I am on him. If that does fail, Tim English is probably my fallback captain option. I could fall back onto a Nick Martin, but I don't know, there just feels something wrong about falling back on a Nick Martin with a captain. So I think I'll fall back to Tim English if Max Gawn doesn't go bananas, but I'm already planning that Max Gawn's going to go huge. So that's what I'm doing. Good luck with your trades this week. Good luck with your vice captain and your captains. As always, you can find me on Twitter at pig_DRSC. If you're in the Dr. Supercoach Slack, you know how to find me. You can send me a DM at any time or at me and I'll have a chat. So, or even in the comments down here in the YouTube channel, if you want to let me know who you're VCing or seeing, I'll jump in and have a chat at some stage. So there you go. Hopefully that helps you, and good luck this week.